It's good now.
All right. Okay. So thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. In fact, I actually started working actively on therapeutic chatbots after listening to Serif's keynote at AAPP in New Orleans in 2022, I believe. So it's very nice to be able to continue this conversation. So the title of my paper is "Does it matter whether one's therapist is an AI?" And here's the basic idea for the paper. We are all aware that there's a lot of important empirical and practical questions related to the issues of AI psychotherapy. Effectiveness for different diagnoses, privacy, accountability, potential secondary harms and risks, and so on. And it is, of course, very important to discuss and analyze them, and if possible, make AI psychotherapy safer and more beneficial for the users. But what kind of had been bugging me for quite some time was the following question. Assuming that we solve all the practical problems and that AI therapy, at least for certain diagnoses, will turn out to be as effective as human-delivered therapy, will it still matter whether one's therapist is a human being or an AI? And if so, why? And this paper is my attempt to answer this question. So, in this very philosophical manner, I'll first invite you to consider with me the following two cases. So here are two cases, therapy and AI therapy. I'll be coming back to them all the time. So first, therapy. Patricia has been seeing a psychotherapist, Toby, for about a year, although she has been struggling with depression and anxiety for quite some time. As a result of her work with Toby, her symptoms have recently decreased, which has led to a significant improvement in her quality of life. And AI therapy. Patricia has been using the services of an AI therapist, Tonks, for about a year. The rest is kind of the same. Although she has been struggling with depression and anxiety for quite some time, as a result of her work with Tonks, her symptoms have recently decreased, which has led to a significant improvement in her quality of life. So crucially, and this is super important, we stipulate that in both cases, the symptom reduction and the related improvement in quality of life are exactly the same. And also, you can think about tongues as having the communicative capacities of current LLMs, or even better, you can think about their communication as being speech-based and not based on typing. Tongues can even be a humanoid robot with cameras and sensors, reading Patricia's facial expressions and monitoring her bodily posture, and so on and so forth. So in general, think about where we might get technologically with AI psychotherapy if we spend some more time on the current trajectory and kind of everything works well. And in light of these two cases, I'd like to invite you to consider the following three possible intuitions. First one is that Patricia in therapy is better off than Patricia in AI therapy. The second one is that Patricia is equally well off in both cases. And the third one is that Patricia in AI therapy is better off than Patricia in therapy. So to say that she is better off in one case than the other is more or less to say that we consider this case to be overall preferable to her, right? And I believe that analyzing these intuitions, you might have your intuitions, I would say something about my intuition about that. Analyzing these intuitions, if nothing else, will enable us to, I hope, demarcate the empirical and practical questions surrounding AI therapy and identify the key philosophical issues at stake. Also, please note that the second option, Patricia is equally well off in both cases, can be treated kind of like as a baseline position. So we should be inclined to accept it if we cannot establish that she is better off either in therapy or AI. All right. So let's start very briefly with Patricia in AI therapy is better off than Patricia in therapy. Very briefly, because I believe that if you think that it is preferable for Patricia to choose AI therapy, you probably make some additional assumptions about these cases which are not there. So I would like to just address a couple of ways of thinking that might guide you towards thinking this thing, but also mention that this is not what I'm stipulating in therapy and AI therapy. So Here are three things that come to mind. There might be more. But I think that these are like key things. So first, maybe you believe that Patricia has a personal preference for using the services of an AI therapist. And I can think about like two scenarios. The first one I call excitement. Patricia is an early adopter, excited about using the services of an AI therapist. And in this case, arguably, Patricia might be better in AI therapy than in therapy. But crucially, and this is very important, this would be a different case. Let's call it AI therapy excitement, in which we would have to separately stipulate that she has this preference. And also, given the argument that follows, I believe that it is not clear that in AI therapy excitement, she would be better off overall, but this depends on the success of my further argument. And finally, I believe that this is an empirical question, how many people are now or will be in the future genuinely excited about the use of AI therapy. So I'm just leaving it there. The second version is what I call apprehensive. Patricia is apprehensive about having a human therapist. And there may be many reasons for this. Patricia may have had bad experiences with previous therapists or with other people in similar roles. Perhaps she has not experienced certain type of caring support from other people. Perhaps she suffers from social anxiety. This might be true of many therapy patients. But arguably, in such a case, Patricia would be clearly better off if she were able to overcome her apprehension and choose therapy. Since therapy might provide her with what is sometimes called a corrective relational experience with benefits extending beyond the therapeutic context. Right? So both with excitement and apprehension, it's changing the cases. So first of all, if you're thinking one of these ways, this is not what we are focusing on here. And second of all, it's going to still be complicated with these ones. The second thing that may come to mind, because it's often considered now in the context of AI therapy, is that maybe AI therapy is cheaper than therapy, and thus Patricia is better off financially. But of course, for the sake of argument, we stipulate that the costs of therapy are the same in both cases. We can stipulate that they are zero in both cases. And again, moreover, if the argument I'll present later is correct, Patricia might still be better off in therapy than in AI therapy, even if therapy is more expensive than AI therapy, assuming that she can afford therapy and that paying for it would not worsen her life situation enough to significantly reduce her overall being. So if she would be able to pay for therapy, and I'm right with my argument that's about to be presented, she might still be better off in general, overall, in therapy. Okay, and finally, you might be thinking, what if therapy is unavailable, for example, because Patricia has no access to a human therapist? This, again, is a very different case. My goal in this paper is to compare therapy with AI therapy. It is a different question how both of these cases compare to what we may call no therapy, in which Patricia does not have access to either a therapist or an AI therapist. For what it's worth, given that in AI therapy, Patricia's symptoms have decreased and her quality of life has improved, and assuming that there are no secondary harms, AI therapy would seem to be clearly better than no therapy. However, this does not mean that receiving AI therapy is necessarily always better than receiving no therapy at all, of course, right? It is an empirical question whether AI therapy can be harmful to some users, for example, by worsening existing symptoms, contributing to the development of new symptoms, fostering dependency, and so on. It is also a practically very important matter to ensure that AI therapy does not produce secondary harms, such as privacy breaches, right? In general, I find it uncontroversial that in AI therapy, just as in human therapy, therapeutic benefits must be delivered within a set of moral, professional, and legal constraints, including privacy, confidentiality, respect for the client's autonomy, and so on and so forth. The same goes for the risk of deception or manipulation. It's often discussed, these days, both in the context of therapeutic chatbots and chatbots in general. I believe that it is an empirical question whether people ought to believe or even vividly imagine that AI is in some relevant respect human-like for the therapy to be effective. I'll come back to this issue. Nevertheless, it might be the case that Patricia is worse off in AI therapy than in no therapy. Again, we are comparing slightly different cases just to make sure that we cover this ground. She's slightly worse off in AI therapy than in no therapy because she is deceived into thinking that her AI therapist, Tonks, is human-like in some important respect, for example, sentient or conscious. Once again, importantly, in therapy and AI therapy, we stipulate that there are no secondary harms, both are available, costs are the same, and so on and so forth. And we just want to consider whether it still matters that one's therapist is an AI. So I believe that unless presented with other reasons, we should find it rather implausible that Patricia in AI therapy is better off than in therapy. So either she is better off in therapy or equally well off in both cases. So let's move on to this discussion of the intuition that Patricia in therapy is better off than Patricia in AI therapy. And here's the idea. I will suggest that the most plausible explanation of the intuition that Patricia is better off in therapy than in AI therapy is that therapy provides Patricia not only with symptom reduction, but also with some basic social good that is missing from AI therapy. And I will consider several candidates for this social good, moving from the most to least demanding. In the full version of the paper, I'll probably consider 5 of them. I'll mention 5 of them today, but consider in more details only 3 of them. For each of them, I will argue that although this good can be provided by a human being, such as Toby, it most likely cannot be provided by current or near future AI systems. Why exactly is this important and relevant? Well, many agree that some social good is intrinsically valuable. It is, in the words of Kaupinen, it is in itself good for a subject. It is something that makes the subject's life better as far as it goes. And if this is right, it matters whether one's therapist is an AI, even if all the practical and all empirical problems are solved. Even if AI therapy turns out to be as effective as human therapy in reducing symptoms, even if we are able to mitigate the risk of secondary harms to the level found in human therapy or lower, etc. Okay, so here are the candidate social goods. The social goods that are most commonly discussed in the literature and most often assumed to have intrinsic value are actually friendship and romantic love. However, neither of them is appropriate in the therapeutic relationship, so I'm leaving them aside and focusing on the 5 alternatives. And crucially, we need to consider at least one of them to be intrinsically valuable for my argument to work. So let's see whether any of them looks convincing. Starting with care. When we think about care in this context, we mean care, of course, in the sense of caring for someone or being cared for, not caring about, like discussed by Frankfurt and others. This is a different topic. And some ethicists of care, for example, Nell Noddings that I'm discussing here, argued that care is not only an activity resulting in meeting one's needs, but it is also an attitude. And Noddings speaks about 2 features of this, unnecessary features of caring. The first one is engrossment, that she characterizes as an open, non-selective receptivity to the cared for. It is an interesting topic and a complicated one, but I'm leaving it aside. I'll just focus on the second element for the sake of brevity. It's the thing is going to be the engrossment. But here, let's focus on the second element, motivational displacement, that she characterizes as displacement of interest from my own reality to the reality of the other. So the basic idea is that in caring for someone, I at least temporarily and partially subordinate my own interests to the interest of the cared for in order to meet their needs. And therapy is actually a classical example of a caring relation. Arguably, Toby might have better ideas for how to spend an hour every week than to talk about Patricia's life, but he subordinates his interests to the commitment to care, which motivates him to do certain things he would not do otherwise. That's why Nodding speaks about motivational displacement. Now we can ask, do current or near future AI have or will have interests that can be displaced? And interestingly, it is an open and lively question in the field of AI welfare if AI systems have interests in the relevant sense, especially that they seem to have some basic preferences and goals. We can talk about it more in Q&A. But nevertheless, most authors argue that simply having preferences and goals is not enough. Interest in the relevant sense have to matter to an entity in question. And this is probably unachievable unless this entity is at least conscious, if not sentient. So most authors conclude that, again, most likely, even though we can not be certain, current and near future AIs will not have interests that matter to them. So if caring requires having interests, they cannot care for someone. Moreover, even if they had interests, it would be a separate issue whether they could displace them in the sense of subordinating, their interests to meeting the needs of someone else. For example, Tong subordinating her interests to care for Patricia. So arguably, care is not a good we can receive from current or near future AIs. The second thing I'd like to discuss is fellowship. Dale Dorsey, in this very nice recent paper, argues that there is something he calls fellowship, and that it is an intrinsically valuable basic social good. For him, fellowship is more basic than friendship. Friendship is compatible with, but not necessary for fellowship. There can be fellowship without friendship. Okay, but what is fellowship? And this is how Dorsey characterizes it. Fellowship experiences, he says, and derivatively the being of a fellow with someone else and the activity of fellowship should be characterized by three features. First, a base level experience, for instance, seeing Graceland, watching a horror film, having a bar conversation. Second, a mutual experience of the other, my seeing Graceland with you and you're seeing it with me, and a mutual pro-attitude towards the experience of the other. All right, so therapy clearly involves a kind of fellowship in this sense. First of all, there is a base level experience, Patricia's and Toby's regular meetings in the therapy room or online, involving conversations about numerous topics. There is also a mutual experience of the other. So Patricia's talking about these issues with Toby and Toby's with Patricia. And there is a mutual pro-attitude toward the experience of the other. So we can assume that even if there are difficult moments, Patricia generally wants to be there with Toby and has positive outlook on him and he on her. Right? So there is the pro-attitude towards each other. But again, note that fellowship in Dorsey's sense requires not only the conscious experience of the thing we are experiencing at the base level, but also, and I quote Dorsey again, crucially, my experience is colored by the fact that you are experiencing it too, right? So once again, assuming that current AI systems are not conscious, Patricia in AI therapy does not receive the basic social good of fellowship. Now, very briefly, togetherness in this wonderful, super fresh paper, James Lewis argued that recently that togetherness is this basic social good, and that togetherness in this basic and explanatorily fundamental sense is what he defines as sharing a sense of the meaningfulness of things. And he takes a very interesting and challenging argumentative path in arguing for that. So he argues that meaningful experience calls for emotional expression. Emotional expression succeeds, but by attaining mutual recognition of the fittingness of the emotion, and therefore meaningful experience succeeds in mutual recognition of its fittingness. And if we are sharing the sense of the meaningfulness of things, we are in this togetherness that he's characterizing. I think this is a wonderful and inspiring idea. It requires a lot of discussion, so I'm not discussing it here in detail. But again, if togetherness is the basic social good, it seems that Patricia can receive it from Toby, but not. Finally, in the full version of the paper, I'm also discussing this idea of being with, developed by Stephen Darwell. So Darwell noticed some time ago that two subjects can be in the same place at the same time and even interact to some extent, but not be there with each other. And then his argued that according to his stipulated sense, two people are with one another when they are mutually aware of their mutual openness to mutual relating. Another interesting idea, if this is the basic social good and if it's intrinsically valuable, Patricia can receive it in therapy, but not in AI therapy. And finally, and this is something I will discuss, in another recent paper, Ed and Lin speaks about the social good of connection or recognition as intrinsically valuable. I'm discussing it because this is probably kind of the most basic way of spelling what's behind these intuitions we have. So least demanding one. This is related but not identical to what James Lang in another new paper calls and characterizes as an interpersonal connection, but I will not go there. So Lin invites us to consider a modified version of Nozick's experience machine thought experiment. And especially he invites us to think about these three scenarios: real world, multi, and solo. So real world is a paradigmatically good life that is spent in the real world. Multi is a life that is phenomenologically indistinguishable from real world and that is unbeknownst to its subject spent in a virtual reality populated by other similarly deceived people, right? So we are in a simulation together. And solo is a life that is phenomenologically indistinguishable from real world and that is unbeknownst to its subject spent in a virtual reality containing simulations of other people, but not other people. So this is solo. And his aim in the paper is to cash out the following intuition. He says, it is far clearer that solo is worse than real world than it is that multi is. And even if multi is worse than real world, it is much better than solo. And in his paper, Lin defends the objective list theory variation of this view with the following spin on the argument. So he's arguing that multi is better than solo, even at what he calls early periods of our life, namely immediately following birth. So what he claims makes the difference are not beliefs, desires, pleasures of the subject. They are kind of the same, because in the early period, they are extremely limited. And still, what makes the difference is simply whether there is someone else or not. And he believes that what explains the intuition for these who share it is that in solo, but not in multi, the person is deprived of a basic social good. And he argues that we do not need to go for anything more than what he calls, like he's discussing two things, so either connection or recognition. Connection is a situation in which two people, two or more beings are conscious of one another. This is connection. And recognition he defines as follows: an entity is in a condition of recognition if and only if another entity is not only conscious of it, but conscious of it as a conscious being, and vertically so. Also, importantly, according to Lin, connection and recognition do not have to involve a pro-attitude. So this is the difference to this is different than in Dorsey's fellowship. For Dorsey fellowship has to invite pro-attitude. Yeah, it has to be appetitive viewing for fellowship, but not for recognition. So again, I would say that assuming that current AI systems are not conscious, the difference between therapy and AI therapy is that in therapy, Patricia receives recognition or connection, but in therapy, she doesn't. And also, I think interestingly for our discussion about AI psychotherapy, according to Lin, recognition is more valuable the less recognition people have received in the past, right? So it simply makes a bigger difference to their overall well-being to receive recognition if you were not recognized in the past. I will come back to that. But I think that if this is the case and people do not receive recognition in AI therapy, it would be especially worth trying to provide people who received little recognition in the past, for example, from their primary caregivers, with human-delivered therapy, because it would make a bigger difference to them. And moreover, seeking connection or recognition may explain why people interacting with a chatbot tend to anthropomorphize it more the more they are socially isolated. And there are some empirical results. So even more generally, when we think about it, the fact that people have a tendency to anthropomorphize AI might actually be an additional evidence for the claim that they find some social good valuable, that there is this interest in social. Anyways, to summarize this part of discussion, I discussed or at least mentioned 5 candidates for basic social goods: care, fellowship, togetherness, being with, and connection and recognition. And I tried to argue that to the extent we believe that at least one of these goods is intrinsically valuable and agree that Patricia cannot receive them in AI therapy, we have a reason to believe that Patricia in therapy is better off than Patricia in AI. All right. Now we have to nuance certain things, starting with the question of fictional and seeming relations. So we can say, okay, maybe AI therapists cannot be our fellows, be together with us, or even connect or recognize us. But it often seems as if they are and do, just as it seems that they empathize with us. Right? And I would say that precisely this seeming is what is being currently measured by the metrics of the so-called Digital Therapeutic Alliance that many of you might be familiar with, which is the Therapeutic Alliance psychometric tools. Adapted to, but it might be a strong word, that are being used to measure kind of the same emotions we are having towards therapeutic chatbots as we used to have towards humans. And once again, whether the seeming in the case of current or near future AI systems will be compelling enough is another practical and empirical question. And I will not discuss it here, right? So for the sake of my discussion, let's assume that it is a perfect seeming, indistinguishable from reality. Okay? But this raises an obvious question. Does it matter that we achieve a real social good and not just a seeming of a social good, right? This is the question. Does it matter that the social good in question is real and not fictional? And here our answer will differ depending on whether we want to go objectivist or something, right? So for objectivists, it does. Think, for example, about Lin's intuition that the life in multi is better than the life in solo. And this is also why all these authors I discussed more or less explicitly are committed to what Lang calls, borrowing the term from the philosophy of perception, disjunctivism about interpersonal connection. So Lang says that, for example, in his examples, if I'm only hallucinating, connecting with an imaginary friend, I will not have an experience of the same basic metaphysical thing. It is a different thing, right? So it matters that this is a real relationship. This is the objectivist sense. But if you're a subjectivist, you can maybe answer that it doesn't. So, for example, a hedonistic variation of subjectivism could say that, if I experience the same amount of pleasure and the reduction of pain, for example, the pain of symptoms of mental disorder is gone, it is enough that it seems to me that I am related to something. Okay? Therefore, if we are objectivists and think that some basic social good is intrinsically valuable, we will be inclined to believe that Patricia in therapy is better off than Patricia in therapy, because in both cases she gains the reduction of symptoms, but in therapy she also gains the social good. So on this view, the answer to the question in the title of my talk, it matters whether one's therapist is an AI. But if we are subjectivists, Patricia is equally well off in therapy and AI. So for subjectivists, it should not matter if one's therapist is an AI, at least not for the reason I discussed. Let me consider one more thing before I conclude. So to this point, I have focused on intrinsic value of the discussed social good. But maybe the social good in question is instrumentally valuable, namely valuable as a means to something else. And here's one possible way of arguing for it. So for example, if, fellowship, being with connection, what have you, is necessary for what people such as Gelsow call real relationship components of the therapeutic relationship. And if the real relationship component is necessary for a genuine therapeutic relationship, and if a genuine therapeutic relationship is necessary for effective psychotherapy, then might be the case that fellowship, being with connection, what have you, is necessary for effective psychotherapy. It's instrumentally valuable for bringing successful psychotherapy about. Importantly, I think, even if we think so, we can still ask whether the social good in question have to be real as opposed to fictional or seeming to be instrumentally valuable, right? So once again, we can ask whether what's working kind of in therapy is the seeming of relationship or the relationship. And I believe that some people might answer, yes, it matters that only a real relationship is instrumentally valuable. And I believe that this might be, to some extent, what Arthur argued for in his paper, although I'm not sure, maybe Dina as well, to some extent. Namely, so one reading of Arthur's idea is that, AI therapies have different ontological and social status than human therapies, which generates the genuineness gap and credibility gap, which might actually diminish effectiveness of AI therapy, right? And probably on the kind of most extreme reading of this argument, it can turn out that my comparison of therapy and AI therapy is actually empirically kind of misguided or impossible, given that it is empirically impossible that AI therapy will deliver the same results as therapy due to the genuineness gap, credibility gap. But I think that it can also turn out, and Arthur admits that it is an empirical issue, that the genuineness gap and credibility gap do not affect the outcomes of therapy that much, or that we lose there, what we lose there can be compensated in some other way, right? In such a case, we are still left either with admitting that Patricia is equally well off in therapy and AI therapy, or looking for a deeper reason for why this is not the case. And the deeper reason is the intrinsic value. If someone answers no to this question, they might say, fictional or seeming relationship is already instrumentally valuable. Fictional relationship or a seeming of a relationship is all we need for the effectiveness of psychotherapy. And then, once again, unless we assume that the relationship is also intrinsically valuable, we should conclude that Patricia is equally well off in therapy. All right, 3 conclusions. First one. First, most likely, at this point, AI cannot provide us with any of the discussed basic social goods. So, if we think, as objectivists do, that some such social good is intrinsically valuable, we can explain our intuition, if it is indeed our intuition, why it is preferable for Patricia to be in therapy, by saying that in therapy, but not in AI therapy, she receives not only symptom reduction, but additionally something intrinsically valuable. Now, if we do not think so, we might be either inclined to say one of these 2 things. First, either Patricia is equally well off in both cases, or if we believe that real social good is necessary for effective psychotherapy, and thus it is impossible that the therapeutic outcomes of therapy and AI therapy are identical, we can say that my whole thought experiment is misguided. This is not describing anything real and empirically possible. Once again, I don't think it's the case. I think we should be kind of considering our intuitions about the intrinsic make. Second, I think that even if we believe that Patricia is better off in therapy than AI therapy, we can still say that in AI therapy she's kind of good enough, right? That it is a form of luxury that therapy brings about not only symptom reduction, but also one of the social goods. And I think that this claim should be confronted with 2 views we can have about psychotherapy in general. I call them narrow and broad. And the narrow view is that all that matters in psychotherapy is symptom reduction, while the broad view is that what matters in psychotherapy is not only symptom reduction, but also the social good we receive. And so, first, if one assumes the broad view, uh, first of all, AI therapy should not be conceptualized as psychotherapy because it does not deliver the social good, at least at this point. And secondly, we should have a strong preference for providing people with human-delivered therapy or actual psychotherapy than with AI. But even on the narrow view, if what I'm arguing for is kind of correct, we should be aware that in AI therapy, patients are missing out on a basic social good, which is either a necessary part of psychotherapy itself or a valuable addition. And maybe I think we should actively support people to whom we cannot provide human-delivered psychotherapy in seeking the social good in other life contexts. This might be especially relevant for people who did not receive much of the basic social good in the past, right? Because as we discussed, it might make a bigger difference. And also, maybe we should be particularly sensitive to those who are inclined to choose AI therapy because they avoid social interactions. This is the apprehension scenario I discussed at the very beginning. Because if we believe that they are missing on something, maybe they are not aware that they are missing on it. And part of the corrective experience of therapeutic care would be to help them get it. Final conclusion. Finally, more and more philosophers and AI experts take the possibility of AI having robust preferences, goals, and interests, or even becoming conscious or sentient either now or in the near future seriously. I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much about AI, but it looks like there is a bigger and bigger conversation about it. I find quite. And in light of my discussion in this paper, I suggest that once this happens, AI might be able not only to help with the symptom reduction, but also provide us with the basic social goods, care for us, be with us, recognize us, and so on. Note that nothing in the criteria for these goods requires that the other subject is human. And I think that to demand that, someone would have to come up with some additional argument. Right? So once we have caring for, being with, togetherness, fellowship, and so on, I don't see what exactly are we missing. And I believe that in such a case, it won't matter anymore whether one's therapist is an AI. Basically, choosing between human versus AI therapists will become a question of preference, just like choosing between male or female therapists, young or old, and so on. All right. Thank you. That's it.
Yeah. Okay, let's get started. So, it's my great pleasure to welcome Joel Kruger, who is philosopher from University of Essex, Department of Philosophy and Sociology. Joel is very well known for publishing many, many, many papers about phenomenology, cognitive science, philosophy of mind. And today he's going to tell us about some of the work that he's been doing about autism. So, Joel, thank you.
Thanks so much, Julian. And many thanks to you, Julian, to Roy, to Damien, to P, and the whole